Chapter 29 deals with agriculture and labor, and I guess, I suppose it could be really characterized as kind of a love-hate relationship between agriculture and labor here in California. I don't know that either side is ever completely satisfied. Without question, California, of course, has been ranked as the number one farm state in the United States since the 1930s. We have an unmatched level of farm capitalization. We did at that time, of course, and it permitted the use of scientific techniques, which really ramped up agriculture here. We, of course, have a great variety of crops due to many climate zones. Many farms were specialized and remain so. So green gold, as they called it once, has now evolved into the empire of agribusiness. We really don't call it agriculture in California. We call it agribusiness because of how farms have expanded in size and how they have integrated themselves so that from the seed, the time it goes into the ground, they actually, pack the stuff right on the farm. So it's a vertical integration, you might say. In fact, that's our next bullet point, talking about the factory on the farm where the crop is produced, grown on the farm, and the packing house is right there, and it goes directly to market right after that. In the early 1900s, the big players were a guy named Fontana, who was the one who promoted the Del Monte brand, which we still see on the shelves today. And then DeGiorgio is another big name, and that, of course, is S&W Foods. Then we had Shenley Industries, and then Norton Simon was a fellow who I think even ran for U.S. Senator from California a few decades ago, and his brand was Hunt Foods. An indispensable ally in the modernization of California farms was, without question, the University of California College of Agriculture. Not to sell short the CSUs, because, as you very well know, you go to school at one of the CSUs that has a whole lot of agricultural education and certainly rivals UC Davis. A.P. Giannini, the founder of the Bank of America, was also a UC regent. His son, Lawrence, succeeded him as bank president and a UC regent, and they were certainly influential in the development of funding of California farms, capitalization of California farms, you might say, and also promoting the University of California as an institute for change and for innovation in agriculture. 9/10 of California cotton was harvested mechanically by the time only 1/10 of the cotton in the deep south was harvested mechanically. Higher incomes led to innovation continuing. And there is a picture of some early cotton harvesters here in the San Joaquin Valley. California growers discovered long before this that the only cost they could keep down was the cost of labor, and they did it with all the economic and political power they had. It's hard work. Many of you, no doubt, grew up in farm working families, or if you worked in farm work yourself, if you have that heritage, you know better than I do that it is not easy work and it is not very handsomely paid. In the early 1930s, efforts to unionize farm labor was often led by the Communist Party. Growers launched a counteroffensive with an organization they formed called the Associated Farmers, with contributions from major business interests, including Pacific Gas and Electric at the time, PG&E. They tried to keep contributions to Associated Farmers confidential, i.e., they didn't want to reveal the names of their contributors, in order to maintain the image of a farmers organization. But, it wasn't exclusively a farmers organization. Associated Farmers worked in intimate cooperation with law enforcement. Most county sheriffs were aligned with agribusiness interests, and so they were sort of, you might say, what's the term I want to use? Ex officio farm officials, in a way, on the side of farmers. Whenever there was a strike threatened, growers or their managerial employees were deputized by county sheriffs, often acting as armed vigilantes. So you can see the relationship there. Kerry McWilliams, we talked about him as an author in a previous chapter. His book, Factories in the Field, and of course John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath in 1939 brought temporary interest in these issues. And of course in 1940, it was Zanuck, I think Daryl Zanuck, who made the movie based on Steinbeck's book. And when they did research for the movie studio actually found that conditions were even more appalling than Steinbeck described in his book. The Associated Farmers labeled Kerry McWilliams as California's agricultural pest number one. So if they had a pesticide, they could spray it on him, so to speak, figuratively speaking. They wanted him gone. One of the other things that happened with farm labor at this time was the Bracero program. As Dust Bowl migrants flocked to the shipyards during the early part of World War II and to the aircraft factories, a need for farm labor arose to replace those workers who went for the better jobs. This gave rise to the Bracero program. There was an informal program like this during World War I, as growers were able to persuade Congress not to include Mexico in the post war program of immigration restrictions. Mexican immigration continued into the U.S. in the 1920s. During World War II, the United States Department of Agriculture assumed responsibility for recruiting, contracting, transporting, housing, and feeding temporary farm workers from Mexico. Uh, Much to the irritation of the growers, President Truman in 1948 transferred the administration of the Bracero program to the Department of Labor from the Department of Agriculture. The program was extended during the Korean War but continued until 1964, 11 years after the ceasefire between North and South Korea. Uh, while minimum standards for wages, transportation, housing, etc. were established during this time, they were mostly ignored, and workers lived in miserable conditions, and racial discrimination in the fields was rampant. Um, Now, even though the canning industry was unionized by this point, that started back in the 1930s. You might remember that chapter about the Depression. California farmers continued to use false arguments to justify the blocking of the organization of labor unions by domestic farm workers, the people who were, picking the crops in the fields. In 1959, though, the AFL-CIO opened an offensive on the farm labor organizing front by establishing the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC. The nucleus of that effort was the Filipino Farm Labor Union, which was started in 1956 and led by Larry Dulay Itliong. In 1962, Cesar Chavez began organizing the National Farm Workers Association with Doris Huerta. Cesar Chavez died in 1993, but Dolores Huerta, who is probably well into her 70s now, actually has a not-for-profit foundation, which is now based in Bakersfield. Chavez was initially against the strikes, but when the AWOC began a strike against grape growers in Delano in September of 1965, his National Farm Workers Association joined it. The grape boycott took hold with public sympathy around the United States in 1966, and by April 4th, 1966, Schenley Industries, who we mentioned earlier as a big corporate farming organization, agreed to recognize the National Farm Workers Association as the sole bargaining representative for its field workers. The next day, DeGiorgio Corporation, which is a big corporation in the Bakersfield area, agreed to allow field workers to decide by ballot if they wished to be represented by a union. Here you have a picture from PBS.org of Cesar Chavez on the left, Congressman Don Edwards in the middle, and then Dolores Huerta attending a funeral for a striking worker who was killed during a strike in 1973. During the 1966 grape boycott, the AWOC and the NFWA actually merged to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. So the UFW was essentially born here. While Governor Reagan and presidential candidate Nixon opposed the boycott, mayors of major cities supported the grape boycott, and by July 1970, most of the large California table grape growers agreed to union contracts with the UFW. The next thing that Chavez and the UFW did was that they took to the fight to the lettuce growers of the Salinas Valley. And to forestall potential UFW success there, some growers actually cut labor union contracts with the Teamsters. Chavez denounced the Teamsters agreements as sweetheart contracts that were privately arranged and not voted on by the workers. And the UFW succeeded in getting contracts in the Salinas Valley by 1977. Due to growers' political power, farm workers were historically excluded from virtually every state and federal provision protecting other kinds of workers. Other kinds of workers had a lot of protection in the workplace, unionization, worker safety, wage issues, so on and so forth, but farm workers were excluded from this sort of thing. The federal government started some positive steps with provisions in the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which included grants to agencies which aided migrant farm workers. In 1966, a minimum wage was set for farm workers of $1 an hour, while other workers, the minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. So still, the farm workers got short shrift, even though a minimum wage had been established. Investigators in 1969 found this, that 95% of farm labor camps had no indoor toilets at the time, and that 99% of them were infested with rats. So the farm worker housing situation was pretty awful, to say the least. In 1975, under Governor Edmund G. Brown, of course, this was his first term in office, the State Agricultural Labor Relations Board, or the ALRB, was established. So there you have a little bit about farm labor, Chapter 29.